Hi everyone, it's Kelly here and welcome to my channel. If this is your first time, welcome back if you've been before. Lovely to have you regardless. Today we are going to be having a look at the books that I read in the month of February. Now, traditionally, February is a bit of a slow reading month for me because here in Australia we go back to school. So I'm a school teacher as my day job. And so, you know, things kind of get a bit busy and I don't get as much downtime for reading as I might in other months. So it's a busy time. Last year I read one book in the month of February. This year I have managed to read 4, but I'm not going to lie, 2 of those are very, very short. And I think I just needed that little boost to kind of get me back into the swing of things, and I've read them both of those short ones right at the end of February. But let's go back to the beginning. As we entered into February, I was reading this fantastic book, The Mercies by Kiran Millwood Hargrave. I had to go back to the library. I renewed this book twice and then had to go physically back into the library to renew it because I had renewed it too many times to do it online. Anyway, I was almost done, so I definitely wanted to hold on to it for just a little bit more so that I could finish it off. So this is The Mercies, and it is set in Norway in a remote on a remote island of Norway, and this book takes place back in 1617. There is this horrific storm, and all of the men who are involved in the fishing trade on this island are out at sea fishing, and this storm kills all of them. They all die. This happens right at the beginning of the book. It's the premise. It's sort of the starting off point of what happens. So it's not a spoiler. Then the women are sort of left thinking, okay, well, where to now? What do we do? And the story kind of evolves from there. So this, women banding together and coping in these really horrific, in this horrific situation where they've all lost loved ones and are now having to fend for themselves in jobs that they traditionally were men's jobs and therefore they were not trained to do. So they had to learn how to do. At the same time, we've got sort of a parallel story that it begins to, and partway through the book, these two stories join up. So we have the first character that we meet is Maren, who is one of the islanders. The second woman whose story this is Ursa. And she is a Norwegian woman also, but she marries a Scottish man who is a priest is probably the wrong word, but he's a religious man, and he has been employed on behalf of the King of Norway to sort of come to this remote island where they've heard the story of all of the men dying, and these women are doing jobs they shouldn't be doing. And of course, there's also this underlying racist thread as well towards the Sami people, the traditional owners of that land, the First Peoples. And those are kind of like that's the situation. And we have these two very young women who are sort of just coming into themselves. So in a sense, it's a coming of age story, but it's not in the traditional kind of sense, but they're coming into themselves and learning who they are as people. And they end up sort of, their stories intertwine in sort of unexpected and surprising ways. And their lives sort of take directions that they may not have anticipated at the very beginning of the book. So the Ursa marries this Scottish man, as I said. He's this horrific kind of character, and that's not a spoiler to tell you that. Like he sort of gives that impression from the get-go as soon as he's introduced. He's this very stern, austere sort of man, and he clearly has no respect for women, let alone his own wife. And it's sort of that kind of is this backdrop, this very harsh, very austere man who wants to kind of rid this island of witchcraft, and that involves getting rid of some strong women and some of the First Nations people from that area. So it's this really tense kind of story, and I really enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 stars, I think. It was a very enjoyable story. I think at the beginning, things kind of progressed in a way that I wasn't expecting. I was sort of expecting kind of more about the establishment of this kind of town of women, this island of women. And it kind of didn't meet that. But then when the stories kind of intertwined, things started to move at a better pace, I thought. So that's the Mercies. I really, really enjoyed this one. 4 stars from me, and a very enjoyable read if that sounds like it's for you. The next book I read was for my book club. So my book club, we're reading around the world. We're reading books from different countries. This month's country was Indonesia, and the book that our group voted on and selected is Saman by Ayu Utami. This was not one of the ones that I had suggested, so I didn't go into this with much idea of what it was going to be about, other than that it was on the back it said it had feisty female protagonists and the enigmatic hero Saman. To be honest, I didn't feel like they were particularly feisty. I guess in some ways they were. Like they knew their own minds and were sort of pursuing things a little bit outside of what was expected of them. The enigmatic character Saman at the beginning kind of comes across as this kind of like a little bit clueless man who has kind of found himself in the middle of being a bit of a hero to people who are being screwed over by the government and by companies and things like that. Sort of he's unexpectedly fallen into this role, and in the middle of the book we kind of hear a bit of the background of how that came to be, and that is interesting. There's some quite unexpected, confusing, confronting things that go on in Saman's story when we're hearing sort of things from his perspective and what went on for him. We start with one of the women's stories. Then very abruptly, Saman becomes kind of the narrator, and then very abruptly again we get one of the other girls, and then another. So it just sort of jumps between these narratives, these interwoven narratives, basically, and it's a weird book. I ended up giving it 3.5 stars. There was some stuff in it that I really did enjoy and found really interesting in terms of being, insightful about the country of Indonesia and its politics and social kind of stuff. But I also felt like it was very confusing at times as well, just in terms of the narrative. It just kept jumping around between these different protagonists, and just sort of it ended up being confusing. And then by the end of the book, I basically didn't like any of them. Like they were not characters that I could kind of get behind, which was a bit disappointing because I really wanted to like a lot of these characters. And yeah, it just kind of petered out, I guess. So it was fine. It was an okay read. It sort of seems from the back of the book, at least, to be considered to be a bit of a classic, or at least a very popular Indonesian book. I'm not really 100% sure why. It was fine, but maybe in its context, it's some of the themes that are explored might be a little bit groundbreaking, I guess, but otherwise I sort of found it just a bit of a confusing read. I didn't think it was very cohesive as a book. And I think I probably would have enjoyed it better as kind of a short story that was one of the stories, rather than trying to kind of weave them together. So that's Saman. Then yes, I told you I gave it 3.5. Yes. Okay. Then we came to like the last couple of days, and I have been just wanting to read a couple of sort of shorter things. I had borrowed a few short books from my local library to encourage myself to kind of get back into the swing of reading a little bit. And the first one that I read of these two that I'm going to talk about is The Hill We Climb, an inaugural poem by Amanda Gorman, with a foreword by Oprah Winfrey, this edition. So this is the poem that was read at the inauguration of President Biden. I remember watching that inauguration and hearing that poem and feeling inspired at the time, and reading it again, it definitely has that inspirational feel to it. It was definitely, I felt hopeful after listening to the poem at the time, and I felt hopeful again reading it now. The time in which this poem was delivered, performed, I guess I should say. We were sort of coming out of the Trump era. Again, and I'm not American myself, but, the world was watching. We were all watching to see what would happen coming out of the Trump era. And I guess, also in the middle of a pandemic and all of those kind of things. So it was, I thought, a really unifying sort of vision that Amanda Gorman has. And I really hope that the US can live up to that vision, because I certainly found it very inspiring, as I'm sure many Americans would as well. I'd recommend it. I ended up giving it 4.5 stars, just because, there were sort of a few things in there that I thought the wording was a little bit, cheesy is the wrong word, a little bit kind of, I guess in that trying to rhyme, it can end up sort of being a little bit, I don't even know what word I'm searching for here. I'm going to say cheesy, but I don't really mean like cheesy. I just mean predictable, maybe? A little predictable in terms of just trying to get the rhyme to kind of work. So, yeah, but I think as the poem goes on, it definitely picks up and really has some interesting moments from a wording point of view. And of course, also just from a thematic point of view. So highly recommended. I really enjoyed that poem. The last book that I read, and I finished this one literally today. I'm recording this on the 27th of February, knowing that I'm back at work tomorrow and I'm not going to have a chance to finish another book. Might do a little bit of reading, but I won't be finishing a book. So I've decided to bite the bullet and say we're done here for February. And the last book that I have read is Brokeback Mountain by Proulx. I actually don't know how to pronounce her surname. Don't know. Have no idea. So she is the author of The Shipping News, which I think is probably her best known piece of fiction. This is just a short story. It is literally 58 pages long. So I read it in a sitting. And I actually haven't seen the film Brokeback Mountain. All I knew was gay cowboys. That's all I knew. That's all I was kind of anticipating going into it. I wasn't expecting anything in particular. So yeah, I kind of went in with no expectations. I was pleasantly surprised in the sense of, the depth of the story and also of the relationship between these two men. And I just sort of, as I finished the story, I guess my overwhelming thought was homophobia and toxic masculinity need to get in the bin. Like, it's such, these two men who clearly had a very, deep level of love for one another that could not frame their relationship because it was outside of their expectations and the expectations of their kind of small town lives. So it's set in Wyoming, back in, it begins in, I think, the 1980s. But these men, they say cowboys, so they don't actually do anything with cows. So I don't think they're technically cowboys. At the beginning, they're technically shepherds, if I'm honest, because that is where, that's their job that they meet on. They both get hired to work with some sheep, kind of making sure the sheep stay together and don't get picked off by coyotes and things like that. So yeah, they're kind of shepherds, but they also do some horsey stuff. I don't know, jack of all trades type of characters, I guess. But the lives that they live are traditional in the sense of, excuse me, being the kind of way that people doing those jobs would have done those jobs for a long time. So, you know, it's not, they weren't living modern city lifestyles. They were living cowboy lifestyles, basically. So, you know, very isolated. They were not expecting companionship even. So I think they were quite grateful to have one another as, you know, just companions. And then that companionship kind of grew into a sexual relationship that neither of them could quite, you know, frame. So at the beginning, they're like, you know, I'm not queer. This is just a one-time kind of thing. And, you know, throughout the book, they're struggling to frame. I think one of the characters, I think his name's Jack. Yeah, Jack. So we've got Jack and Ennis. Jack, I think, is gay. Closeted gay, maybe. Ennis, I think, is possibly bisexual. He certainly feels quite okay about his, so he has a wife as well. I think at the time when they first meet and engage in that sexual relationship, he has a fiance. But then when they're sort of reconnecting years later, he's married and he's got 2 kids. And Jack is also married, but I sort of got the impression that for him, it was this much deeper sort of thing. Anyway, I don't want to talk too much about it. It's a short story, so it's definitely something you can pick up and read in an afternoon, in one sitting, like I did. And I would recommend it. I ended up giving it, I think, 4 stars. Yeah, 4 stars. It was definitely a challenging read, but one that I think was worthwhile. You know, I don't think it's the be all and end all of queer love stories, definitely not. But I think, you know, given that it was written back in the 90s, it probably, you know, started to break down some barriers, I think, in that space, in the publishing industry. It started off as a story that was published, I think it was in the New York Times, I want to say. Yeah, oh no, sorry, the New Yorker. Back in 1997, and then was published as a book, and then of course became the film that so many people know and love. So I may watch the film now that I have read the book. But yeah, I definitely recommend giving it a go. It's a real short read, and it has some things that you will get out of it. I mean, I have read other reviews of this where people have said, you know, they were disappointed because they thought it was going to be more, you know, they personally didn't think that these characters were actually in love, that it was just a sort of lustful slash, you know, it served a purpose of, you know, keeping them entertained and having that companionship while they were sort of in those lonely times on the mountain. But I personally saw love in that relationship. Especially when they sort of come back together after being separated and kind of not knowing what each other was doing and where each other were for a couple of years. Just the way that they kind of came back together. I thought that was a loving relationship. And I know Ennis also, you know, as they're sort of parting that first time, you know, feels sick to the stomach. So, you know, like I feel like it is a relationship of depth. And certainly, you know, as events unfold, I think I personally saw a lot of love in that relationship, but also, you know, the effects of a society that doesn't accept a homosexual relationship, and not only just the society, but also in their own minds, not being able to accept what they, or frame their relationship in a way that meant that they could pursue it. Yeah, which was tragic and sad. So it's a tragic and sad book, but I did enjoy it, and I think you might too if that sounds like it's up your alley. All right, that is it from me. So I had 4 books that I read in the month of February, and all of them were pretty okay. Like, there were no duds in this set. I'd say I probably enjoyed Saman the least, but I definitely didn't hate it. So yeah, overall this was a successful reading month, especially for February, which is traditionally quite a slow reading month for me. So I'm glad that I was able to get through these books, and I hope that my reviews of them have been helpful for you in terms of making decisions about whether you want to source any of these books and give them a try. All right, that's it from me. I will see you on the next one. Bye.